After a couple of days in Quito, I realized something important. I hadn't come to Ecuador to live in another cold mountain city like Bogota. The whole reason I left Bogota was because I wanted somewhere warm, tropical, and completely different. So I bought a bus ticket and headed south to the city where I was hoping to start a new life, Guayaquil, a coastal city on the Pacific coast. But getting there meant another long journey through the Andes Mountains and arriving in a completely unfamiliar city in the middle of the night. In the last video, I arrived in Quito after crossing the Ecuadorian border. After a slightly unusual first night in a cheap hotel, I decided to continue on to Guayaquil, the city where I planned to settle. The bus journey from Quito to Guayaquil takes about 8 hours, and although geographically Ecuador isn't huge, travelling across it can take a lot of time. That's because the roads through the Andes Mountains twist and turn constantly, like a coiled snake. If you look at the distance on a map, it doesn't seem far, but the actual road journey can be 4 or 5 times longer. Eventually, the bus left Quito and began descending through the mountains. The scenery along the way was incredible. Grey rocky peaks, waterfalls cascading down cliffs, and huge valleys stretching into the distance. It's one of those journeys where the landscape keeps changing every hour. At some point during the journey, the bus driver decided to put a film on the small TV at the front. I remember the movie was Shaolin Soccer. If you've never seen it, it's basically a football film where the players use martial arts and the ball turns into a flaming fireball flying across the pitch. Completely ridiculous. I sometimes thought in my time in South America, there was a national competition on the buses to put on the most ridiculous, low-budget movie possible. And Shaolin Soccer was one of them. But for an hours-long bus journey, it was quite entertaining. As the journey continued, something interesting started to happen. The mountains slowly disappeared. The air started getting warmer. The landscape changed from cool highland scenery to tropical lowland vegetation. Palm trees started appearing. The temperature rose, and suddenly I felt like I'd arrived in a completely different country. At one point during the journey, the bus suddenly pulled over to the side of the road, and a group of police officers boarded the bus. They asked everyone to step outside and line up next to the vehicle. Then they carried out a quick body search of all the passengers. Situations like that can feel slightly tense when you're travelling, but in reality they were just checking for drugs and making sure everything was in order. Moments like that are actually fairly common when travelling through South America. Police checkpoints, passport checks, bag searches. It's just part of the experience. Eventually the bus reached Guayaquil, but there was one small complication. It was almost midnight, and I just arrived in this large tropical city. I didn't know anyone, I didn't know where anything was. When I stepped off the bus, there were several taxis waiting outside. One driver immediately approached me and offered to take me to a hostel. But I noticed something. His taxi didn't have a meter, and that can sometimes lead to interesting pricing. So I looked around and found another driver, and we agreed on a fixed price of $3. The problem was, neither of us could find the hostel. I had the address written down, but the street system in Guayaquil was slightly confusing. Many of the streets use the word manzana, which literally means apple in Spanish. But in Ecuador, it also means something like residential block, which made the directions a little confusing. So we spent a while driving around trying to find the place. At that moment, I started imagining all sorts of possibilities. What if we couldn't find the hostel? What if it was closed? What if I ended up wandering around the city at midnight looking for somewhere to sleep? That's not a good scenario because you don't want to be wandering around a Latin American city after midnight, not knowing where you're going. Some areas can be pretty dangerous. And being in a completely unfamiliar city at night can make your imagination work overtime. But then again, I reminded myself, things are working out. Eventually, after driving around for a while, we found the hostel. I paid the driver, walked inside, checked in, and collapsed onto one of the beds almost immediately. After 2 long bus journeys, a border crossing, and several days of travelling, I had finally arrived in Guayaquil. And that moment actually felt pretty significant because this wasn't just another stop on a trip. This was the place where I was planning to start a completely new life. I didn't have a job yet. I didn't know anyone in the city. And I only had about 300 quid to survive on. But somehow I had made it. The next morning, I woke up in the tropical heat of Guayaquil and stepped outside to explore the city for the first time. What I didn't realise yet was that the next few days would completely change my situation. Because within a week of arriving in Guayaquil, I would somehow end up with a place to stay and a job.